Now, in just over 2 weeks, Tanzania will be heading to the polls. The country's president, Dr. Samia Hassan, is seeking a second term with the promise of keeping the economy growing if she's re-elected. Hassan faces 16 other political candidates who each have their own growth plans for the near $90 billion economy, which is expected to grow at 6% this year. Now, Shani Smit-Lengton, economist at Oxford Economics Africa, joins us with her analysis of the economy ahead of the polls. Shani, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. And let's start there from an economic perspective, right? What are the key issues shaping this year's election?
I'd say the key issues would revolve around jobs, cost of living, and service delivery. So inflation remained relatively low at 3.4% in September, but Tanzanians are still feeling the pinch of high prices.
Okay.
And this is because food price inflation, which comprises the largest share of the CPI basket, is still very high at 7%. And wage growth hasn't really kept up with this. So Tanzanian households are definitely feeling the brunt on their day-to-day purchasing power, and the government is very well aware of this. Another key issue is youth unemployment, as well as jobs in the formal economy, as well as service delivery. So these will be the things that are on the back of Tanzanians' minds as they head to the polls later this month.
And then how does that affect public expectations going into the elections? I mean, you've just laid the map out for us. It seems like on the ground, people are not doing well, even though we are seeing, expectations of growth of 6% for 2025.
Yes. So the economy has performed very well, but yes, it's one of those things that the macroeconomic indicators don't necessarily translate into the everyday lives of Tanzanians. So just to give some figures, the economy is currently growing at about 5.6%, which is very, very good. And something worth noting is that budget execution over the past couple of years has improved quite remarkably, which I think Tanzanians are quite impressed by. For example, in 2024-25 fiscal year, tax revenue exceeded its targets. And interestingly, government expenditure is more of a problem of underspending than overspending. So that means that there is a little bit of scope from the government in order to step up its game, in order to make the everyday lives of Tanzanians a bit easier. So I think Tanzanians are aware that there have been a lot of positive trends, but they're not necessarily feeling that in their everyday lives.
Okay.
And that will sort of form the expectations going into the elections.
And President Hassan's campaign has been really pegged on unlocking even further growth. Shani, talk to me about the opportunities in some of the big sectors there. Where is the party looking at unlocking growth within the Tanzanian economy?
So I'd say the key sectors would be natural gas, agriculture, tourism, and the digital economy. For natural gas, it's really important that the next government prioritizes finalizing agreements, especially the LNG project in the Lindi region, because that will attract a greater level of FDI inflows.
Yeah.
Agriculture is also another very important sector, and the government will really need to modernize its production and its storage facilities, especially as the population is expected to grow and the risks of climate change become more prevalent. Tourism is a very important sector because this is a large foreign reserves generator. So over here, the government needs to focus a bit more on improving its infrastructure and transport networks. It has done very well in the past, say, 3 years, but more can still be done. And then in terms of the digital economy, there is a lot of opportunities there, but the government will need to start involving the private sector a lot more in order to facilitate entrepreneurship and innovation. But across all of these sectors, it's really important that the government implements the correct regulations.
And just on that, you talk of, the private sector and its involvement in also just assisting with growing the economy. Talk to me about appetite for investment in Tanzania at this point. Are we seeing those kind of collaborations taking place, or are we seeing perhaps the private sector hanging 10 just as we wait for the elections to unfold?
Yes, definitely. I think with any elections, the private sector investors tend to hold off a little bit just to see what the government is going to do. I think in the case of Tanzania, the ruling party is more state-led development. So the private sector has sort of taken a bit of a backseat.
Okay.
But ever since President Hassan has been the president, she's definitely prioritized improving the investment and business climate. So I do think in a couple of years, the business space will grow for the private sector to become more involved. And they will definitely need to work more closely with the private sector if they want to achieve the level of growth that they want to continue achieving.
And maybe let's look at the other side of the page, right? What risks and challenges could slow Tanzania's economic momentum after the elections?
So I think one big one would be rising debt levels. For now, I'm not too concerned because a lot of this borrowing has gone towards large-scale infrastructure projects, which is expected to have a high return on investment. Tanzania also has a very good track record of completing its projects, which is good, but still the government will need to make sure that it still manages its debt levels well. And I think perhaps another challenge would be policy implementation, especially with new reforms, as these take time. But they will need to be executed well in order for the government to execute on its intended results with these reforms.
And just before I let you go, maybe let's look at Tanzania on a regional level and how it fares against its neighbors in terms of economic resilience and investment potential.
I think Tanzania has a lot of potential, and I think what counts in its favor is that it has a very diverse economic portfolio, and it also has a good sense of economic and political stability. If I can just compare it to some of its neighbors, in recent months, Rwanda has experienced quite a bit of political instability due to the war with the DRC, whereas Tanzania has been quite calm. With Uganda, they've been implementing quite a few unfavorable regulations in the past few years, whereas Tanzania has been implementing favorable regulations. And then in Kenya, that country is struggling with a debt and fiscal crisis, whereas Tanzania's fiscal and debt position is still pretty sustainable. So I think just considering that, Tanzania is definitely well positioned in a regional context.
All right, let's leave it there, Shani. Thanks so much for your time and taking us through the economics at play in Tanzania ahead of that all-important national election. Now, that was economist at Oxford Economics Africa, Shani Smit-Lengton.